Hey guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth Through Ministries, bringing another exciting Bible study today. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the concept that I am titling Zeus is in fact Satan. So today we're going to be doing a Bible study about the enemy, the devil, the adversary that we commonly know. This entity, we usually refer to him as either Lucifer and Satan. And basically, what the concept of this video is going to be is that, like many of these other fallen angel entities, that the chief one, the one who is the head of the rebellion at this time in history, we are saying that he has presented himself to different cultures by different names. And we're saying the chief one that we're going to really be talking about is the Greek god Zeus, the thunder god, the storm god, is in fact Lucifer or Satan. And this is going to be a really fascinating study today because it's going to show a lot, it's going to give a lot of context to the flow of history. It's going to show a lot of spiritual warfare. It's going to bring alive a lot of sections of biblical history. And it's going to bring alive a lot of sections of really highlighting the spiritual warfare that's been going on between the true and living God, Jehovah, and this false rebellious entity that we call Lucifer or Satan. So that's really going to be the purpose today. But Zeus is, although he's the main entity we're going to talk about, this video could just as easily be entitled Baal is Satan, or the Roman god Jupiter is Satan, or we're also going to talk about the Norse god Thor a little bit at the end. And so what we're really trying to show, like I said before, is that Satan has really presented himself in different he's the same God showing up, really the same entity with different names in different cultures. And I'm just going to give a disclaimer at this point that in order to really understand the concept of these videos, you really do need to have some basic understanding of the Genesis 6 narrative, and even to some extent the divine council worldview that goes back to Heiser. Those are things that I do adhere to. I know that a lot of people on my channel are right there tracking with me on that stuff. Some people may be tracking with me on some of it and not others. That's totally fine. But if you don't have a basic understanding of some of these concepts, it may be a little bit difficult to follow what I'm saying, even though I'm going to try to recap before I go headlong into this study. Because basically, what we're saying with biblical history, we know that God created the heavens and the earth. We know that He created everything, including us, but we also know that He created the celestial beings that we know as the angels. And I do believe that God had and still does have a council of these celestial beings that helps him to administer and rule over the creation, the cosmos, the universe, whatever term you want to use. And that there was this rebellion that happened prior to the temptation of Adam and Eve, and that we really that Christians throughout history have believed that Lucifer, or the dragon, that's how he's referred to in the book of Revelation, that he was the leader of this rebellion, and that basically all of human history has really been following in the wake of that rebellion, that war, that spiritual war that started between God and the dragon. And that's not really going to be that outstanding of information. But here's the part where you really need to understand the Genesis 6 narrative to know what I'm talking about. We know that there was the stage of this rebellion where the Watchers, this group of fallen angels, they came down to the earth and they cohabitated with human women. They produced this race of giants. But the leader of that rebellion was not Lucifer. It was not Satan. That there was this other entity that's called Semyaza in the book of Enoch, and him, and then this other entity that we have named Azazel. Those are the entities that are really the ones who led that rebellion at that stage. And then they get cast down into hell. We see this in the later portions of the New Testament in places like Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter. We have these references to the group of angels that were operating in the pre-flood world. They're thrown down into Sheol, into hell. And then we have this second group of angels coming on the scene, and that's where I believe that Lucifer, Satan, he is really coming onto the scene in full force today. And what we're going to talk about is in mythology, we see this concept. In Greek mythology, We have the Titans that are on the scene at the earliest stages of history, if you're going according to the worldview of Greek mythology. And you have Kronos, and then he's eventually overtaken by his sons, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. And then you have the Olympian gods on the scene. And you see this parallel all throughout the world. So if you really want to understand what we're talking about, you need to understand that there are two groups of celestial beings. The biblical worldview says they're both rebellious, they're both evil, they're both fighting against the true and living God. But regardless, we're saying that there is these two groups of angelic beings. One is operating in the pre-flood world, one is operating in the post-flood world, and that is the specific aspects of the Genesis 6 narrative or the divine council worldview that you need to understand in order to understand the concepts that I am going to be laying out today. So that's really where we're going to start. We're going to just give a little bit more introductory material for Lucifer or Satan, and I'm really going to talk about how the Bible itself really connects him to this Greek god Zeus, and we're going to see this in the book of Revelation, which is really interesting. It's a reference that is somewhat subtle, but if you're really gleaning it, it's not unfair to say, okay, the Bible really does make this connection between Zeus and Satan. And when you get into the history of this, it's going to really come alive. And this is something that I touched upon briefly when I was going through my series on the book of Revelation. And we were going through the epistles, and I talked about how that the epistle to the church at Pergamum, it says there that the seat of Satan is in that city, and everybody goes, well, what does that mean? The seat of Satan is in Pergamum. And you understand that there was in this ancient city this giant massive temple complex to Zeus. And once you understand that, and you understand what a prominent city that Pergamum was in the post Alexander the Great era, what's called the Hellenized era of history, Pergamum was a major city in the ancient world until it eventually declined and fell as you move further and further into the Roman era, and then obviously the post-Roman era follows that. But that's really the concept that we're going to be getting at today. But going a little bit further into this concept of Lucifer and Satan, I want to really turn to the book of Isaiah, because this is really interesting, and I wanted to include this material. I'm going to read Isaiah 14:12, because we see that this entity that is referred to as the dragon in the book of Revelation, he's the serpent that tempts Adam and Eve. It's all the same entity. In Isaiah, in our English versions, he is called Lucifer, and we know that he is the leader, the chief leader of this angelic rebellion. So I'm turning to Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12, pretty well-known verse. And it says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which is weakens the heavens?" And then for it says, "For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit in the mount of the congregation. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High." So we have this angelic entity. And when you read commentaries on Isaiah 14, there's kind of this parallel where there's this connection to the king of Babylon that's being made. But then it's really, when you get into the typology, or it's really looking past this and going, the king of Babylon is being compared to Lucifer or Satan. And there's these really interesting connections that are being made there. And there's a lot more I could talk about the context of this. But here we have this really great description of what happened in the ancient past of our history, where this entity, once again, I keep repeating that entity, Lucifer, this is where he was lifted up with pride in his heart. He wanted to be equal to the Most High and ultimately overtake the Most High, the true and living God. And he says, "I will extend my throne above the stars of God." When the stars, once again, that's the angels of God, the divine council of God. You see, I've talked a lot about that in my other videos, how there is these connections between the stars and the angels. And you see that in places like the book of Job and the book of Revelation. So when you know that connection between stars and angels, a lot of parallels in your Bible, a lot of dots are going to get connected. A lot's going to really make sense. But yeah, so once again, Lucifer is saying, I will ascend above the heights of the cloud. I will be like the Most High. And then once again, but then what happened was this rebellion, and we see this in Revelation chapter 12. I'm not going to read this verse right now, but this entity, the dragon, he took a third of the angels and led them into rebellion. The rebellion failed, and they were cast out of heaven, down out of the angelic and heavenly realms. And this is what happened. But the interesting thing I want to highlight, there's a lot of great clarity that we get when you understand how the translation of this name Lucifer actually happened. Now, I think Lucifer is a proper name for this entity, and we know that even many occult groups who worship this entity, they do refer to him as Lucifer today. So I think it's not unfair to call it, it's an accurate name for this entity, but I want to point out that this name of Lucifer actually was put into, this really comes from the Latin Vulgate of Jerome. The Hebrew word here is Hallel, which can be translated as morning star, or it can be translated as shining one, or it can be translated as brightness. And it's interesting when you understand why Jerome chose this name, which once again is an accurate name. That name Lucifer was actually a name connected to the planet or the god Venus, and which once again means morning star or bright one. So that was the name that Jerome, not out of any sort of intentional bait and switch or anything, but he decided to choose this name Lucifer as that translation. And then from the Latin Vulgate, it kind of continue on, and the translator of the King James Bible, that's what I'm reading from, because there's a lot of reasons for that, but it found its way from the Latin Vulgate into the King James Bible, and then that's how it's translated in a lot of the English translations today, which is interesting. There are some people, I've listened to podcasts like Blurry Creatures, and Timothy Alberino has even said that the name Lucifer, even though he doesn't necessarily have a problem with it, he actually goes as far to say that this entity doesn't have a name in the scriptures at all, which is interesting and not completely unfair. And he says that he just simply refers to it as the dragon. He actually said that it's a nameless entity. He actually says that there's no name that's given to it, almost like there's a curse on it or something, which is interesting. And there's a lot more I could get on that, but I really want to move forward to this concept that the morning star, the shining one, he is Lucifer, and we know that the term Satan, Hasatan, in the Hebrew, that means the adversary or the opposer or even the accuser. That is the same, essentially the same entity as this entity here. Now, I know that a lot of the people on my channel who follow the thesis of Michael Heiser, they're going to know that Michael Heiser put forward the theory that there are actually multiple angelic entities that could be this Hasatan, and he talked about how there could actually be multiple Satans in a sense. And I don't want to get too confusing at this point. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but I still kind of adhere to the traditional thought that Lucifer he's the king of the fallen angelic entities in this post-Diluvian stage. And we'll get more into that in just a second. But like I said, as we're going to cover this, I just want everybody to remember, really the chief god, really the leader of the fallen angels in the pre-flood stage is this guy named Semyaza. And then after that, we have this entity Lucifer, and I'm taking it from that name here. And now I've given all of that context. So I know that was a long preamble, but let's go and let's connect this entity Lucifer to Zeus, and I think this is going to be really cool. Turning to the book of Revelation. Okay. All right. So we're going to go to the epistles here. We're going to go to Revelation chapter 2, and I'm going to just read enough of this to get the context. I'll start at verse 12, but really the emphasis is verse 13. This is to the epistle to the church at Pergamos. And to the angel of the church of Pergamos write, these things saith he that has the sharp sword with two edges. I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. And thou holdest fast my name and has not denied my faith, even in those days where Antiochus was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwelleth. So verse 13 is what we're really getting at, that Pergamo, the city of Pergamos, or it can also be called Pergamum, multiple ways where it comes from the Greek. And this is a city that is in Asia Minor, so that's modern day Turkey. If you know your geography, you got Greece on the western side of the Aegean Sea, and then you have Turkey, and you know the peninsula. It's a big, it kind of loops. And so you see the map. You got Greece and you got Turkey, and right there on the other side of the Aegean Sea from Greece, on the western coast there of Asia Minor, that is where a lot of these cities, that the cities that are being referred to in the opening chapters of the book of Revelation, including Pergamum, that's where this is taking place. Now, like I mentioned this before, but I'm going to expand upon this concept. When you really understand the spiritual warfare that was going on, because the Christians here in the first century, they were suffering in Pergamum. They're in the midst of this city that was a center of paganism in the ancient world. And this giant, massive temple to Zeus, this massive temple complex, it was a pretty impressive temple just from an architectural standpoint. I don't mean that in the sense that I'm praising the paganism, that's very wicked. But in terms of the grandeur that comes with religious buildings, this was a big temple. And what I want to talk about is Pergamum. Pergamum, it's really a fascinating city because what we need to understand is the history here. Alexander the Great conquered essentially the entire ancient world, and that's from around 331 BC, so around 300 years before Christ comes onto the scene. And we know that Alexander the Great was the king of Macedon, and then essentially the Greeks, because Macedon is to the north of the traditional Greek city-states. But his father Philip really was instrumental in uniting the Greeks, and his father Philip wanted to go east, but he died under suspicious circumstances. And then Alexander was the one who took up the mantle, and he's talked about in Bible prophecy in places like Daniel chapter 8. Fascinating. And he's also the Greek kingdom is also talked about in the kingdoms of Daniel chapter 2. But anyway, Alexander, he went and conquered the Persian Empire, which included places like modern day Turkey, the Levant, the Middle East. He went into Egypt, and he went to Persia, and he really went all the way to India. But after Alexander the Greek, I'm sorry, Alexander the Greek, Alexander the Great died, what happened is that his kingdom divided up amongst these successor states, what was called the Diadachi, these successor kings. And you have places like the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled in Egypt, the Seleucids, they ruled in modern day Syria, what was called the Seleucid Empire, and there was a kingdom called the Kingdom of Pergamum, or the Pergamum Empire, that ruled in this part of Western Turkey. And that is why this city of Pergamum, it was so prominent. It was the capital of one of these successor states. And I have the dates here, 282 BC to 129 BC. Eventually, this kingdom got absorbed by the expanding Roman Empire. So this was a very prominent city. This was a capital city of a prominent kingdom in this portion of the world in modern day Turkey. And this temple to Zeus it was a massive temple, like I've already said, and it had this massive altar called the Pergamum Altar. And you can look this up. If you Google the Pergamum Altar, it comes right up. And later in history, it was excavated and taken to Berlin, and it was absolutely massive. And one of the things I found extremely fascinating about this altar, the Pergamum Altar, was that it has this depiction of the Olympian gods fighting giants. This goes to Greek mythology. So you see the connection here to Genesis chapter 6, because the entire premise of so much of what we talk about on this channel is that the biblical history is the undiluted true history. But what has been called myths and legends, they find their way into the stories of all the other cultures around the world. So the pagan mythologies, even though they're the corrupted versions, and often they're the versions that are inverting everything to make Lucifer or Satan the good guy, and to make the true and living God that we worship the bad guy, you can still, if you're careful, you can still glean a lot of truth from the mythologies from across the world, including Greek mythology. Now, we don't take the jot and tittle of these stories to be exactly accurate. That's going to lead you astray. But in very general terms, you can glean into these mythologies like Greek mythology or Roman mythology or Norse mythology or Celtic mythology, and you can glean things. And when I say in a very general sense, what I mean by that is these gods, they do exist, not exactly as they're portrayed in the stories, but we are saying that these fallen angels are the gods of pagan mythology, and that giants existed. They pop up in these stories all over the world in places like Greek mythology and Norse mythology, etc., etc. That is what we're getting at. And depicted on the Pergamum altar that was in Pergamos, which is called the seat of Satan, you have these Olympian gods fighting these battles with these giants. And that giants, they play a part in Greek mythology, just like they play a part in mythologies all across the world. And that connects to so many dots of so many things that we've talked on this channel again and again and again, which once again is very fascinating. But going back to Revelation 2, verse 13, the reason why I believe, and I'm not the first one to put forward this thesis, this has been talked about by other guys in the Genesis 6 community, Derek Gilbert or Judd Burton or whoever else. I've really followed in the research of these guys in many ways. I've read a lot of their stuff. I respect their research. I think they've done a very good job many respects. They're very intelligent men. But this idea that Zeus is connected to Satan or Lucifer is a biblical concept. And I think one of the reasons why this verse is making that connection is because the seed of Satan, the Bible is saying that Zeus is simply another depiction of this entity, Satan, and therefore this massive temple committed to Zeus in the city of Pergamum, the Bible is referring to it as the seed of Satan. So you see that this connection is not idle speculation. It's not me connecting dots are not there. It's essentially implied or outright said in the text of Scripture, which is very, very fascinating. So we've talked about how the kingdom of Pergamum, you have this temple to Zeus, you have this Pergamum altar, you have the Olympian gods, and you have these giants that are depicted on this altar. Now, I just want to talk a little bit more about Greek mythology before I expand upon this concept further. In Greek mythology, like I said earlier, the father of Zeus, because you have the Titans, they were the ones that were ruling before the Olympian gods when you get into Greek mythology. And the father of Zeus is Kronos. Then he was the god of time, the most powerful of the Titans. He's the king. He's the king of the gods. But then, once again, these Olympian gods that come on the scene, the brothers, Hades, Poseidon, and the most prominent is Zeus. They're the ones who take over from the place of the Titans. And the connection that I am making is I believe that, once again, this is following in the steps of guys like Derek Gilbert. The Titans, that's referring to the Watchers that have already been cast down into hell after the great flood of Noah. So Semyaza is, in my mind, he's Kronos, and he's Saturn in the Roman depictions. We'll get to that too. Zeus is going to be Jupiter in the Roman pantheon. Saturn is Kronos in the Greek pantheon. So you can take. I had to write all this down, so you guys might want to take notes. But once again, you have the Titan pantheon and you have the Olympian pantheon, and you see this once again. There was a group of angels on the scene before the flood, and then you have a different group of fallen angels on the scene after the flood. And then there's a lot more that we could get into on that, but that's really the concept that we're going for. And the other thing that I really want to point out, and this is really, really important, is that Zeus is the storm god, the thunder god. And we're going to see this connection in these other entities that we're going to connect them to, such as Jupiter, Baal, and even Thor. They're always the storm god, the thunder god, or the sky god. They're very, very connected. So that it's for whatever reason, Lucifer or Satan has always chosen to present himself to these cultures around the world as the thunder god, the lightning god, the storm god, the sky god. And he's always the king of the gods in these pagan pantheons, in these pagan mythologies. And this is really the reason why this is especially fascinating is because the scriptures, they have many titles to refer to Satan, such as the prince of this world, or the God of this world, if you interpret 2 Corinthians 4:4 that way, which I do. But prince of the power of the air in Ephesians 2:2, Satan is always the storm god or the sky god. He's the chief of the gods. It's amazing how the scriptures make that connection, calling him the prince of the power of the air. And when you look at the event, the binding of Satan in Revelation 20, and then I think Revelation 16, the final vial, the seventh vial of Revelation 16, which ultimately is what binds up Satan's power, the final vial is poured out upon the air. I've talked about this a lot in my studies on the book of Revelation. And I don't want to get too much into that right now because we'll get sidetracked from our main point. But Satan is the prince of the power of the air. And he's always the sky god, the storm god, the lightning god, the thunder god. I'm just going to read Ephesians 2:2 real quick to illustrate my point, and then we'll move forward. Okay, here we go. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2. Yeah. Okay. I'll start at verse 1 just to give the context. This is Ephesians chapter 2. And you, referring to believers, hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins, wherein in time past you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now works in the children of disobedience. And then he goes on to, if you read Ephesians 1 and 2, it talks about all these the great doctrines of grace with salvation. And there's a lot, that's a whole study in of itself that we probably should go back to at some point. But once again, Satan here is referred, or Lucifer, he's referred to as the prince of the power of the air. And that is what he always depicts himself as in these pagan mythologies. And the other thing that you're going to see here, it really illustrates how Satan is always trying to create a counterfeit kingdom to God's kingdom. If you really adhere to the divine council worldview of guys like Heiser, and we know that the true and living God, that I think the way I look at it is that these angels were never intended to receive worship themselves. It's only reserved for God. But the true and living God, he delegates certain tasks to these angels to help administer the creation. And so God he has these celestial beings. I'm talking about the loyal angels, the elect angels, the good angels, and they're delegated various tasks to help keep everything that has been created running. And so what does Satan do? He has created his own counterfeit system where he has made himself the sky god. He's made himself the chief of the gods, what I would call the lowercase g gods, and he's essentially created his own counterfeit council with himself at the top of it. And in Greek mythology, that's why he is referred to as Zeus. So the other thing I want to talk about, once you have this understanding of history, it also can give you a lot of extra detail and clarity to the spiritual warfare that's going on in a lot of events in biblical history. And one of the events I want to talk about is what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes and in the Second Temple. Now, this is once again a very fascinating concept. Like I said, Alexander the Great, he went east, he conquered all of these kingdoms, and then they broke up into these successor kingdoms. And the most prominent of those kingdoms would probably be the Seleucid Empire in Syria and the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt. But in 168 BC, the Seleucid Empire actually went and conquered Jerusalem. And Antiochus IV, he was called Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was the son of Antiochus III, who was called Antiochus the Great. You can look up all this history online. So he comes into Jerusalem, and at this time in history with the Jews, with the Old Testament people of God, the Hebrews, this is after they had come back from exile in Babylon. They had rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, they had rebuilt the temple, all of that had come. And we know, you read about the great biblical figures in Old Testament history like Ezra and Nehemiah, who brought reformation and even revival to the Old Testament people of God. So we're talking about the period that follows all of that, the return of the Jews to their homeland. And here we are in Antiochus Epiphanes. He invades and takes over Jerusalem. And he really, at this point in history, you need to understand that there were some Jews who remained very, very faithful to the Old Testament practices. And there were others who started to compromise to the Greek culture that was coming in. They referred to as Hellenized Jews. And you actually see these distinctions later in history when you get to the time of Jesus, that there was always kind of this back and forth battle that was going on between the Jews that had somewhat succumbed to the Greek culture, which the more strict Jews saw, and I think to a large extent rightly so, saw as compromising because of the paganism. But there was these two groups, the Hellenized Jews and the more faithfully observant Jews. And here we are at this point in history, and Antiochus Epiphanes actually came in to the temple, and he actually established this worship of Zeus. When you think about the context I just gave, this worship of Satan in the second temple. And he actually sacrifices this this pig in the temple, in the second temple complex. So this is, well, the book of Daniel talks about this and the abomination of desolation that was going on there. You can read about all of this in the book of Daniel. This was all prophetically prophesied, especially in Daniel chapter 8. But when you make this connection that I've already made, that Zeus is in fact Lucifer or Satan, and you think about that, that's essentially Satanism coming into the temple of God. You see the spiritual warfare that was going on. I mean, if Antiochus Epiphanes comes in and he establishes the worship of any pagan god in God's temple, that's obviously bad no matter what. But when you understand who this entity actually is, it gives even more significance. It gives even more clarity to what was going on at that stage in the ancient world. And this is what led to what was called the Maccabean revolt. And if you read the apocryphal books, which once again are not inspired, they're not part of the canon of scripture, that's how Protestants interpret it, but they still have much good historical value, and those are worth reading if you read them with the correct lens and you have a good grid for interpreting that stuff correctly. You can profit greatly from reading the apocryphal books such as the book of Maccabees. And this Greek invading pagan culture coming into Jerusalem, coming into Israel at this time, it led to the Maccabean revolts. And there's a lot of history that I could go into in more detail. If that's something you'd like me to talk about more in the future, let me know in the comments below. So we have this city of Pergamum, which I said was the capital of the kingdom of Pergamum, the Pergamum Empire, whatever title you want to talk about it. We talked about this temple of Zeus. We talked about how the history of how later, once again, the Maccabean revolt followed Antiochus IV and the Seleucids coming down into Jerusalem. So Zeus is a big entity on the scene because the Greeks, they conquered so much of the ancient world. Their culture and even their religion went to so much of the ancient world. It gives a lot of highlight to a lot of ancient history. So I think I covered that sufficiently. But like I said, there are other entities which are the same as Zeus for all intents and purposes. And once again, they are Lucifer or Satan. So let's talk about this god, Jupiter. Now, this is going to the culture of the Romans, the pantheon of the Romans. Now, Jupiter, for all intents and purposes, is the same as Zeus. And even the Romans themselves, if you read the ancient Latin writings of the Romans, they believed that their entity that they were worshiping, the chief of their pantheon, he was the king of the gods, and he, once again, he's always the thunder god, and the Romans are very particular about calling him the sky god. Same thing. Jupiter is Zeus, which once again, I know I'm repeating myself for emphasis. Jupiter is Zeus, and Zeus is Lucifer or Satan. And I don't have a ton to talk about with Jupiter because he's so similar to Zeus. We don't need to belabor this too much. One of the things I learned that was really interesting is that the priest, when you get into the priesthood of the Roman religions, there's a lot of intricacy to their religion, which would be much more, might even do a video on this at some point, because they had these different priesthoods for different gods, and I was really interested. They had very strict rules for their high priest. The high priest of Jupiter was called the Flavian Dialis. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he was appointed by the Pontifex Maximus, who was the chief of the College of Pontiffs in the Roman religion. Now, I don't want to talk about this too much because I've talked about it in some of my other videos, but we know that the term Pontifex Maximus which was one of the most prestigious religious positions in the Roman Republic. That title today is used by the Pope of Rome, who is the head of the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church. So it's kind of hard for me not to at least make mention of that in this video. But going back to the Flavian Dialis, he was the high priest of Jupiter, and there were certain rules that were associated with this high priesthood. For example, in the early, more Republican era, you actually couldn't leave, like they weren't supposed to leave the city, even for like a single night. And later on in history, when you get to the Empire era, following the rule of Augustus, they actually relaxed it, where they said, okay, the high priest of Jupiter can leave the city for a couple nights, but he's got to come back. And also, there were rules about, usually this was a patrician of the upper classes who was appointed. I think in the early era that was a full-on requirement, and there was a very specific rite of marriage for these priests. Like there was a lot of very intricate rules that went into the Flavian Dialis, which isn't necessarily connecting to our larger study, but interesting points. And then one other interesting point was that Julius Caesar at one point held this position until his political fighting with the Senate of Rome actually led him to kind of, this position was kind of taken away from him in the light of it, all that was going on with the politics of that time. So Jupiter, but the main point here that we want to get is that Jupiter is, he's the storm, not just the thunder god, and he is the sky god. Once again, the prince of the power of the air. We're just trying to build this case that the storm god, the lightning god, the thunder god, the sky god, prince of power of the air, Lucifer, Satan. You see the connections we're making. So we've seen this with Zeus, and now we're moving on to Jupiter, and now we're going to move to Baal. And I was really tempted to make Baal the first of these because he's the one that shows up at the earliest point in our history, in the history. If we were going to go chronologically, it would actually be Baal, then Zeus, then Jupiter, and I would probably cover Thor last. These are the four entities that we're covering. But I decided I wanted to start with Zeus because it lays such a good groundwork for the study. But Baal he was a Canaanite god. He's very prominent in the Old Testament. We see him come up again and again. Once again, he's the storm god, and he's also the god of fertility. And there were many wicked practices associated with Baal. We know that he's often worshipped in what were called the high places on the mountaintops, and that this worship of Baal was a menace to the Old Testament people of God. To those who remained faithful, Baal was a very powerful adversary. And we're connecting him once again to Zeus or Jupiter, because they're the lightning god, the thunder god. Baal is the storm god. We see how these connections are consistent all throughout. And it's really not that controversial. When you read a lot of Bible commentators or theologians throughout history, they're usually pretty consistent in connecting Baal as a representation of Lucifer or Satan. So that's actually not that controversial of a concept. Now we see that Baal pops up as early as the book of Judges. We know the Israelites invade Canaan under Joshua, and the book of Judges is really the period following Joshua all the way up until the establishment of the monarchy under Saul, David, Solomon. But that's as early as he props up. And probably the most famous period in history that Christians think about when they think of Baal. They think of the prophet Elijah and his dealings with Ahab and Jezebel, who worshiped Baal. This is in Israel. This is in the Old Testament period, the book of Kings under the divided kingdom. And I'm just going to read, I'm not going to get into this context a ton, but if I go to 1 Kings 16:30, just to establish this, and Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him, in verse 31. And it came to pass as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab built, he made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. So Jezebel, and this is just another point where men, you got to be very, very careful with the women that you have romantic relationships with, because they'll either make you or break you, which isn't the point of this study, but it's pretty hard not to pull this out. If you're a godly man and you're with a wicked woman, we see this all throughout scripture. They're gonna pull you down again and again. We see this with Samson. Think of it. Samson was physically the strongest man, arguably, who ever lived. I mean, he was killing hundreds of people with the bone of the donkey. He's just whipping people left and right. The guy was he was a real strong, tough dude. He was, the 80s movie action hero type, but his relationship with Delilah pulled him down. Solomon, he's the wisest man who ever lived, short of Jesus Christ. And the pagan gods that he was dealing with pulled him down. And Jezebel, he definitely accelerated the fall of Ahab, to say the least. But I digress. That's not my main point. But Ahab, he built this grove to Baal. He worshipped and served Baal. Him and Jezebel both did. And God raised up the prophet Elijah, which is he's one of the mightiest prophets in the Old Testament. If you want to talk about it in those terms, talk about who's mightier and lesser. All of God's faithful prophets or saints, they're all used of the Lord. But we do see that it is fair to say that the scriptures really emphasize the point that Elijah was greatly used of the Lord. That's not unfair to say. We even see that in the typology of the prophets in Revelation chapter 11, and I could go a lot further on that. But once again, Baal was a major deity. He was really the chief deity that was pulling the Israelites away from the worship of the true and living God. So there's a lot more I could say on this, but once again, we've been emphasizing this point that he's connected to Zeus or Jupiter or whatever else. And it's really interesting. This is something I wanted to pull up. This is fascinating. So I'm going to read a little section here from the Biblical Cyclopedia, Strong's and McCulloch. Excellent biblical resource. If you've never used it, anything referring to the scriptures, see if there's an article on it in that encyclopedia, the Biblical Cyclopedia. It's an excellent resource. And referring to Baal, now Baal was an entity that he shows up in the Canaanite pantheon that we talked about. He shows up in the Assyrian pantheon and the Babylonian pantheon, a very prominent deity of the ancient world. But here's the connection that's going to be really interesting. It says, this is referring to Baal, traces of the idolatry symbolized under it, referring to Baal, are even found in the British Isles. Interesting. Baal, or Baal, being, according to many, the name of the principal deity of the ancient Irish. And on the tops of many hills in Scotland, there are heaps of stone called by the people Bel's Cairns. And when it says Bell there, B-E-L in the English, Bel's Cairns, where it is supposed that sacrifices were offered even in early times. So according to Strong's and McCulloch's Biblical Cyclopedia, they're saying that this entity, Baal, that was worshipped in the Near East, in the Middle East in ancient times, in biblical times, was also worshipped under whatever name you want to give to it, Baal or Baal or Bel, B-E-L, in places like the British Isles, in places like Scotland and Ireland, amongst the ancient Celts. And I actually ran into this very same concept when I've been doing research on the ancient history of North America. There's a site in North America that's called America's Stonehenge, which is in modern day New Hampshire. I read the book Ancient America by Barry Fell, who is an alternative archaeologist who is somewhat controversial. His findings are really ridiculed by the mainstream archaeological establishment, so I want to get that out for the sake of truth and clarity. But according to his findings, he believed that site, America's Stonehenge, that there was a connection to the worship or the elevation of this Irish god Bel, B-E-L. So I think there's a lot we could expand upon this concept further and do more research on this in the future if that's warranted. But I think there is a real connection that the Celtic god Bel, B-E-L, is connected to the Babylonian god Baal in the Middle East. So just taking everything that I've said here, and let's connect these dots for a second. Satan is the prince of the power of the air. The Bible says that we know that God, the true God, he is the one who is sovereign over everything. He is the one who is in control of everything. But we also know that the Bible talks about how Lucifer or Satan, he has this counterfeit system of control over the nations of the world. And he tempts men to serve him through these false religious systems of paganism or occultism, or he simply tempts men to sin, which gives him greater control over them through things such as pride or sexual lust or greed for money or a greed for power. There's all these different ways that Satan is very good at corrupting the hearts of men. But here's my main point, that Satan is ruling over these nations. The scripture talks about this. He's referred to as the prince of the world in John chapter 14. He's referred to as the prince of the power of the air in Ephesians 2:2. We have many similar titles in the New Testament that talks about this. And just looking at the history that we've looked at, we've made the case that Lucifer or Satan is Zeus amongst the Greeks. He was Jupiter amongst the Romans. He's Baal that was in places worshipped in places like Canaan, Assyria, Babylon. And we're also saying that the god Bel amongst the Celts, the Scottish, the Irish, that you start to look at it, you're like, man, this entity has been venerated and worshipped by a lot of cultures across a large swath of territory. Once again, highlighting the spiritual warfare that's been going on. It really gives a lot of historical context to what the Bible says about Satan having a lot of control over the nations of the world. A lot of these dots, when you look at all this history through this biblical worldview and you see what the scripture is saying about this entity, it really paints a strong picture of what's been going on throughout history. So now I only have one more entity I want to cover, and I'm not going to talk about him quite as long, is this god Thor from Norse mythology, and he's been portrayed positively in the Marvel movies, and he's portrayed as this hero in the comic books. And I'm not going to get into a whole side tangent about what movies we should be watching stuff. Christians, use your judgment, use your wisdom, use your discernment. But the point I'm trying to make is the Disney-fied version of Thor makes him out to be this great good guy. It's a fictional movie, but and that's how Zeus is always portrayed as the good guy. Well, let's be fair. Greek mythology also portrays him as a scoundrel. He's always sleeping with different women. He's very promiscuous. So we know that he's the chief of the gods, but he's also portrayed as a scoundrel in the myths and the stories. But generally speaking, we can say that these entities like Zeus or Thor, it's inverted. They're the good guys in these stories fighting these giants. That's what Thor is. Thor is the son of Odin. Odin is the sky father in Norse mythology. And Odin is the one who is the chief. He's the chief deity in the Norse pantheon. And then his son Thor is the one who is always fighting the frost giants. And this is a very prominent concept. And we see that Thor, once again, he is the thunder god. His hammer, Mjolnir, is this hammer that he uses to bring down the lightning. It's this massive weapon of war. This hammer can be used for building things as well. Very, very powerful. Thor is this entity that's always fighting the frost giants. Very similar to what we were talking about with the Pergamum Altar, where Zeus and the Olympian gods were fighting giants in the Greek mythology. You see the similarities here. Now, I want to do more research on the Norse mythology. I don't want to make connections here that aren't as clear as what I've already made with the other one. But it would seem to me that Odin is probably being connected to Semyaza or Kronos or Saturn. I would probably say Odin's probably that one because that's the father of Zeus or Jupiter that we talked about in these other. So that's probably who Odin is. And then Thor, once again, would be Zeus, Jupiter, Baal, Lucifer, Satan. Obviously these stories vary from culture to culture. You even need to be we can make these connections in good conscience. We need to be careful with it. But even in the Norse, once again, you see these same things: the thunder god, the sky god, and they're fighting giants. So you look at all these cultures across the world, the Norse and Germanic cultures, Northern Europe, the Celts, and then you go south, you got the Romans in the Mediterranean, the Greeks in the Mediterranean, and you have Baal, Canaan, Assyria, Babylon. This entity has been venerated in a large swath of the world. And I'm sure that it'd be really interesting for me too to explore. Maybe there's connections in the Far East to make as well. But there's a lot more I could say, but this is a pretty fascinating study. So that's where I'm going to leave it, guys. I think you see the connections I'm trying to make. I think I've made my case for it. Thanks for bearing with me, even as I repeated myself a lot for emphasis in this video. We're going to be making more videos soon. We're going to be going out into the field. If you guys have been, thank you for everybody who's subscribed to this channel. It's been really fun to see the channel grow. Also been super grateful for everybody who's been willing to come on and do interviews. God has blessed this channel with a lot of interviews lately. A lot of great stuff going on with this channel. So we're really hoping for this ministry to just keep things going, keep things moving forward. So last thing I'm going to say before I sign off, if you guys like this type of content, if you want me to make more videos along these lines, please let me know in the comments below. I want to put out the type of content that you guys want me to put out. A lot of this ministry has been going toward going out in the field, research, whatever else. But if you guys want more Bible studies along these lines, let me know. I'll certainly provide that. Also, I've said this before, I want to say this again. If you come across this channel in God's providence and you've had an experience with anything related to giants, demonology, UFOs, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, all of that stuff that we call paranormal stuff, if you have a story to tell, you have something that's going on with that, and you want to have someone to talk to about it, please share that with me. You can either put it in the comments, or maybe more appropriately, you can send me an email. I can interact with you more privately on that. We'd love to hear your stories about what's going on. If you want help with that, prayer with that, please let me know, and we'll take things forward there. So that's really the study we have today, guys. We have discovered that Zeus is Satan. That is going to be the title of this video. So I hope you've enjoyed this Bible study. I hope the Lord is blessing you wherever you're at. So all that being said, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless everybody. If you have been blessed by the ministry of RTM, then please consider supporting our ministry through Buy Me a Coffee, and check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.